And it's a great pleasure for me to be here today and to talk to you. The first thing I should say is that I am a senior civil servant, not a soldier. My grandfather served in the army in the First World War, my father in the Royal Air Force in the Second World War, but I've never served. And the reason I say that is I want to talk to you about leadership that is perhaps a little bit more in the business space, in the bureaucratic space, rather than on the battlefield. And despite the best efforts of the Commandant and his team yesterday, I have very little to offer on, for example, platoon assaults. But it's very important, I think, to understand leadership in that wider context, because I know you will be thinking Sandhurst and other educational establishments within defence a lot about the battlefield. But if you get leadership wrong in that wider space, I think it works its way back into the battlefield. If you've spent the money wrong, if you've administered the system wrong, it's the soldier on the front line who eventually feels the effects of that. So the title, Identifying the Need for Leadership Change. Now, I don't recall coming up with that title. I don't quite remember where it came from. But the very fact of not recalling where it came from led me to think that one way in which I can structure this talk today is to think what the title really ought to be for this presentation. And we'll arrive at that at the end, having gone through various different versions of the title. I remember when I first talked to Justin about coming to speak here, I came up with this title, The Myth of Leadership. I think I must have been having a particularly cynical day that day. But the reason I thought of that title was there have been lots of examples of really bad leadership in history, haven't there? Right up to the current day. And quite often, I think, we mistake people who are in leadership positions for actual leaders. Now, that's a cynical perspective, of course. There have been many great leaders in both military and civilian affairs. But I think it's worth pondering the possibility that some of the things that are said about leaders are not about great leaders, they're about people who filled leadership positions. And rather pretentiously, I thought, what's a good example of this? Well, a good example would be in AD 69, the year of 4 emperors, when the Roman Empire had 4 emperors, 3 of whom met very violent deaths, and who no one remembers nowadays, except for the 4th one, Vespasian, who created a new dynasty. And so you had 3 people there who occupied a leadership position, the leadership position in the known world of the time, who no one remembers. And there's something about that year of 4 emperors that says to me that leadership is a qualified thing, something you have to understand at a very deep level. But I'm not going to talk about the myth of leadership today. I think it's just something we have to have in our minds, that we ought to take a critical view of leadership. We shouldn't take at face value what people tell us about leadership, including what I'm going to tell you today. The second title I came up with was What Makes a Leader? And there are different models of leadership out there, aren't there? And you, no doubt, do a lot of this here in the academy. But when I was a young civil servant at the then Civil Service College in Sunningdale, I went on leadership courses, and a lot of it was done by video. Funny old thing, you probably do some of this here. And I remember being shown the classic Laurence Olivier film of Henry V, wartime film, where that was one model of leadership. You know, Laurence Olivier addressing the troops at Agincourt, once more onto the breach, dear friends, once more. A very inspiring, powerful model of leadership. Counterpoint to that was the classic Henry Fonda film, 12 Angry Men, where, for those of you who've seen it, you have a leader who kind of emerges quietly from within the 12 people in that courtroom and persuades all the other people in that courtroom. I'm sorry, this is a big spoiler if you haven't seen the film. Persuades all the other people in the courtroom to change their perspective on whether the person in the dock is guilty or not. And he does that by building the evidence and questioning the evidence and reason and logic, a totally different model of leadership. And the third one that we were given in those days was another film which was of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there's a particular scene that we were shown, which was President Kennedy meeting the Joint Chiefs in this dramatized documentary. And the Joint Chiefs are recommending an aggressive course of action involving attacking Cuba, and they present this course of action to the President. The President reflects for a moment and says, "Thank you very much, gentlemen. I'll need to go and reflect on that." And he stands up and he walks out of the room, leaving the chiefs behind, and the chiefs are appalled. You know, where's the leadership, they're saying? Where's the leadership? Well, of course, for me, it's a very strong model of leadership because JFK has gone off to reflect on what he's been told and maybe not to agree with it. So those are the kinds of models that we were given as young civil servants. And the question I had for the people who were teaching me this was, across that spectrum of different leadership models, what do you want me to be? And I think it was left fairly hanging at that point. We weren't told that a senior civil servant should be a particular type of person. We have moved on a lot, and if you look online, you'll find something called the Civil Service Leadership Statement, which actually makes it clear what kind of leaders the civil service wants. You'll find that on gov.uk. But in those days, I think it was left hanging too much. So we had those different models of leadership, and we didn't know which one to adhere to. And then I thought another title for this talk might be Leading Through Change. You know, the word change has appeared in that first title, the one that came up as we opened. And but then I thought, change. Now, there's a loaded word, a really loaded word. So what do we mean by change? So forgive me a short diversion into what we actually mean by change, leading change, because I think this leads us to some quite important conclusions. What we mean by change, it's a word, it's a brand, the word change, that has lessened in its power in recent years, I think, and people often talk about change fatigue, particularly in big bureaucracies where people are being told we have to change all the time. And so that word change isn't a popular word at the moment in the wider, in wider defence, I think. And I think one reason for that is that change isn't necessarily the thing you do, it's the thing that happens to you. It's the thing that's going on around you. And so I think a better word is adaptation. That we, as individuals and as organisations, need to adapt to the change that's going on around you. And I often use a kind of evolutionary analogue here for the world of evolution, where successful organisms adapt to a changing environment, and if they don't adapt, they die. Or if they adapt well, you get dramatic changes like dinosaurs into birds. Dinosaurs disappear from the face of the earth, but they haven't really disappeared because they've evolved to the new setting that they find, and they've become birds, so they're still with us. So, and I'm searching here for metaphors for change and adaptation. This one, evolution, I think doesn't work to the fullest extent, because another example of evolution is crocodilians. And they haven't really changed much for very many millions of years. And would we as an organisation want to think of ourselves as alligators or crocodiles? Or maybe in some contexts, yes, but generally speaking, no. And so evolution is something that it's a passive process. It happens to organisms. So when we think of ourselves as an organism, as an organisation, do we want also to think of ourselves as passively adapting to that world out there? And I think actually that's what happens a lot of the time. I think the big organisations often do kind of passively adapt, and that's why that term change has become a less worthful currency, because when we talk about change, it is us struggling to adapt, but in ways that are very passive. So we change the wiring diagram, we change the organisation, we change the name of the organisation, but actually the world might have changed around us in a way that we're not adapting to terribly well. So I think leadership, to bring all that into a conclusion, leadership is about forcing adaptation in big organisations, because if you let it happen passively, If you just sit in the organization, the world around you changes, and we all know about how the international security situation changes rapidly and dramatically sometimes. If you just sit in the organization and let that happen around you, you'll have done all that passive incremental evolution. The leader has to come along and force real adaptation to make sure that you aren't left behind in that changing world. So let's think of another title for this talk, and I think that title is Leadership Adaptation. You have to adapt to survive, but if you survive, you're a success. And you want to go beyond survival, don't you? You want to win, and so you're a success. So let's run with that title for a little while. What does that kind of leader need? Well, I think the first thing is to be a time traveler. And that, by the way, is rather bizarrely a Lego replica of the Time Machine from the 1960s adaptation of the H.G. Wells novel, which appeared in a shopping centre, and so it's the only picture of a time machine I have. So you get that, I'm afraid. But what do I mean by that? I mean it's about that adaptation only works, that leadership of adaptation only works if you can project your mind into the future as a leader, and you can see what's coming. And you may not get it right totally, but you've got to attempt that. Otherwise, you're just living in the here and now, and it will catch you out. You've got to know where you're going as an organization. And that doesn't mean that you anticipate every single thing that's going to happen in the future. That would be impossible, of course. But it does mean that you need to have positioned yourself as an organization in a way that means that when that thing happens, you're ready for it. So the time traveler thing I think is very important. But you also need to know what success and failure feel like. As you're thinking about projecting yourself into that future, what does success or failure feel like? And I think all too often, we think about the success, and we don't really think about the worst case. And that shapes the way in which we project ourselves into the future. So how do you get into that future? Well, I think the leader, the successful leader, codifies that thinking about the future into a strategy. A strategy is basically how you get from here to there. That's all a strategy is. But a strategy also has to be something you can actually deliver. So the leader has to be someone who owns a strategy you can actually deliver. I'm afraid that history and public life is full of strategies that aren't deliverable and haven't been deliverable in the past. People come up with concepts, white papers, whatever it might be, strategies that aren't connected to delivery. And so in defense, I think it's fundamentally important that we have that connection between the overarching concept and the thing that you deliver in the end. If you haven't got that, the strategy itself is worthless. I often say anyone can write a strategy. Turning strategy through a plan into the delivery is a key facet of leadership. But also being aware that that strategy may face various branches in the future history that you're dealing with. That it's by no means guaranteed that because you've set out a strategy that the world is going to adhere to that. And so we have a tendency, I think, as leaders to think in linear terms. The world is going to follow a particular course. And we need to be extraordinarily careful that we don't get trapped into that, because the world has multiple things that it throws at you, which you need to be able to adapt to. And that's this thing about, what's the chicken, what's the egg, the real world or the plan? And again, I think the leader needs to be someone who recognizes that the world is not going to adhere to the plan. Now, that may seem stating the obvious, but all too often, I think particularly in our world, in defense, where we are very good at planning. We're very good at what we want to do and what we want to achieve and the milestones and the key decision points and so on. We're very good at that. But all too often, I think that slips into believing that the world is somehow going to conform to our plan. And I think in a separate part of my life, I'm a very keen skier. And one of the most important things that a ski instructor ever said to me was, don't expect the mountain to conform to your skiing. You know, you have to ski the way the mountain wants you to. And I think as a leader, with a plan, with a strategy, you have to recognize that we can't expect the world to conform to our plan. We have to be sufficiently adaptable in our plan, in our strategy, to adapt to what the world throws at us. And then, as you think through that future history, how do you mitigate the risks that might face you? And that's the Chilcot report, which tells us that the Iraq intervention didn't go terribly well. And how do people at the beginning of a process where you're planning for example, a major intervention, anticipate the things that are going to come at you that are going to throw you badly off course? And I always counsel people to think about what's lurking in their peripheral vision. Because as human beings, we are hardwired to think about the things that we want to think about. You know, our plan, the likelihood of success. But there will be things out here that we need to be attendant on, which will catch us out very badly. And this is something I've learned myself in my career. I now keep a page in my notebook, which is peripheral vision, of things that just occur to me, you know, when you're walking down the corridor, oh, I need to think about that. And if you're not careful, it disappears by the time you're back at your desk. Writing those down and being cognizant of the fact that there are things in your peripheral vision that are going to throw you off course, I think is fundamentally important to all of us. And one big thing that comes out of that title, if you like, the leadership of adaptation, is the need for leaders to be curious and questioning. We'll come back to this in a moment. But for me, the most impressive leaders are those who have a constantly questioning attitude. They aren't cemented in their worldview. They are people who want to hear different and sometimes challenging viewpoints. So having that attitude as a leader, it seems to me, is a given. If you haven't got that, the chances of being a successful leader are minimal. But what are we leading as leaders? And of course, you know, there's a potentially very long answer to that question. But I think we're leading a couple of things. First, we're leading issues, aren't we? So the issue for your platoon assault is contained within that notion of the target and what has to be achieved. At a governmental level, it might be about an overall policy. At an army level, it might be about balancing the books and developing capability and force structure that meets the financial resources available. So a lot of leadership is about taking those issues and leading them through to a conclusion. And I'm sorry, I can't resist a plug for the Chilcot team's publication, The Good Operation, which we launched in January with the full endorsement of Sir John Chilcot himself. And you'll find this online. If you search on Google, The Good Operation, it comes up on gov.uk. That's the PDF version. The actual printed version, if you want copies, do contact me. It's very small. And the reason I talk about this is the idea of the good operation is it helps policymakers with those peripheral vision issues and with those structural issues when you're taking decisions. It's about how to lead issues. And it doesn't give you the answers, it gives you lots of pointers on all the kinds of things you need to take into account as you're taking decisions. And the interesting thing about the good operation, by the way, is the extent to which it's become of interest across government. Because I think colleagues across government see that we have common questions we should be asking ourselves. You know, it's about that questioning, curious mentality. We have common questions we should be asking ourselves, which in the good operation are very specifically about the defence, military, pole mill domains. But actually, a lot of those questions are ones that we should be asking ourselves about vision, about the use of analysis and evidence, about strategy, about measuring your success, and so on. So I commend the good operation to you. I'm sorry I couldn't resist a plug for it in there because it's about leading issues. But the other thing that leaders lead, and again, some of this may be obvious, but I think it's worth stating, are people. You know, kind of obvious, but I think all too often we get swept up in your leading the issue and you forget the need to lead the people. And there's this fragile thing, Homo sapiens, a human being with all its complexities and its nature versus nurture and its psychological makeup and its vulnerabilities and its strengths. You have to take this strange organism and take it to that distant place that you're envisaging as a leader. And you have to bring that organism with you individually and collectively to that place as a leader. And it's a real challenge to do that. The issue, leadership, is itself challenging, of course, because issues tend to be complex and sometimes they're wicked and difficult to contain. Of course, that presents all kinds of challenges. You can't do that unless you're also bringing the people with you. So another title might be Leadership is all about people. You know, education, 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 location, 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 people, people, people. You can't achieve that leadership of issues unless you're leading your people well. And what do you need to lead those people well? So I think you need certain qualities. And this is a personal view, but I'll give you my personal view on what qualities you need to lead people well. First of all, I think the very successful leader needs to be extremely self-aware. You need to be able to stand outside yourself and see yourself as others see you. And I think that's particularly true the more senior you get. That thought about self-awareness needs to be embedded at the beginning, and you must never lose sight of that. But when you get to being very senior, it's possible to be distanced from that self-awareness. And I know myself that, you know, when you arrive somewhere like Sandhurst or at a command, you're treated very well and with respect, and it's very easy as a senior leader to get full of yourself. And I often say to people, I said this to the Army Generalship program a couple of years ago, and it might be the reason I've not been back to it, by the way. I said, think of yourselves as highly evolved primates, you know, because it's very easy to think that you're senior because you're somehow special and different. But you're senior because you've got lots of experience and you have a certain amount of expertise, and ideally you're good at leading people. And I think people need to peel back all those layers, that accretion of specialness, and remind themselves that they are basically highly evolved primates, and that the reason that they behave in the ways that they do is because human beings think in particular ways. And I always commend people to read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and many of you might have read it, about the basic structures in the brain and the ways in which we think. And the Kahneman model of the brain, which you know, is evidentially underpinned, is that there are two systems, and forgive me for going over this if you've heard it before, but system one is where we build templates of how to do things. So none of you are thinking through in any great depth the business of sitting there listening to me, because you have a template which tells you that you're sitting there and writing or whatever you're doing. The usual example, I think Kahneman uses it himself, is driving a car. You don't have to relearn driving a car every time you sit in it. You've learned how to do that. And you're going, people at Sandhurst, the cadets, they learn how to be a soldier. That's their system one template. System two is where you have to think. And we as human beings tend to avoid system two because the brain is the most energy intensive part of the body. Our ancestors in deep history as hunter-gatherers would have had to have hunted and gathered pretty much 24 hours a day to keep the brain ticking over, to keep system two working. So our ancestors thought through and developed templates. So that rustling in the undergrowth, it's better to have a template that tells you that that might be a saber-toothed tiger than to sit there contemplating the problem. So back to driving your car, you've got your system one, you're driving down the road, it's all fairly straightforward. You're almost in a trance-like state, aren't you? That's system one. But then you come to a junction, and there's some children on the pavement, there's a car doing something unpredictable, the junction itself is complicated. That's when system two kicks in. And you have to think it through. And you can tell that system two has kicked in because your pupils dilate, your eyebrows furrow. It's energy intensive. You can't keep it up for very long. Now, the reason I tell you all this is I think that in our professional lives, a lot of the time, we're stuck in system one. And that's fine. You know, why would you need to think through everything in depth and new every time you encounter an issue? But I think it catches us out sometimes because we start to apply system one to problems that demand system two thinking. And getting back to self-awareness, I think in terms of our self-image, we're often stuck in system one. You know, we've accreted status, and our template of ourselves is very much a system one template. And sometimes we need to get outside that, apply system two to ourselves, think critically about ourselves, and understand how other people see us. So self-awareness, really big thing. Secondly, effectiveness. If you're going to lead people, you have to be effective. It's no good standing up there and saying, I'm your leader, and then people see you go off and not do things well. So there's a certain standard you have to apply to yourself as a leader of people, which is to be good at what you do. It might sound obvious, but I think we forget that a lot of the time. We kind of put people on a pedestal, and ultimately, you want to see the person not on the pedestal, but being effective at what they do. So for me, the good leader of people is someone who is demonstrably effective. And then being recognizably human. Now again, you know, you might think I'm laboring the Homo sapiens point. We are, all of us, recognizably human, looking around the room. I don't mean that. I mean demonstrating those human characteristics that enable us to connect to the people that we lead. So for me, that's about being honest about yourself with your team. So, you know, some people are extremely good at the people management thing and the getting on with other people. Others less so, but those who are less good at it, I think need to just be honest with people about it and say, well, you know, I am not a natural people person, but I'll do my best, and do give me your feedback, and I'll work through that. But for me, the people leadership thing is a deeply ingrained psychological aspect of leadership. That, and I'll talk about myself a little bit and my attempts to be a decent leader. I, for example, have a mental map of the people that I lead and the people that I know, a mental map of their football supporting allegiances. So for my sins, I'm a Charlton Athletic supporter. And that is a way of connecting to people. If they're not supporting a football team, you remember where they last went on holiday or where they're planning to go on holiday. And the important thing about that is you can't mimic those behaviors. You know, I had a line manager once who said to me that I modeled the leadership behaviors well. Now, I don't think that's enough. I don't think you can model these things. You have to live it. It has to be something that comes from the heart. Because if you go up to someone and actually you're not at all interested in football and you say to them, well, you know, how did Arsenal do last night? They know that you're faking it. You have to have a genuine interest in people and in the things that are important to them. And why is that important? Well, for the leader of people, they have to buy into you. You know this about the battlefield. People have to buy into their leaders on the battlefield. But I think in that wider space, people also have to buy into their leaders. And they have to have that human connection that spans the individual islands that we are as human beings, that connects people and enables the led to buy into the people who are trying to do the leading. And then inviting challenge. Now, if you do look at the Good Operation, that publication I mentioned earlier, you'll find this at the very back of it. This is the MOD's challenge guide. And when we started doing the Chilcot work, we realized that there was a danger in policy making, in decision making, that people tended to groupthink, that they didn't invite in challenge, they didn't invite in diverse opinions, and therefore that tended to lead them to certain conclusions. And so we developed this thing, the challenge guide, and on the left-hand side, as you look at it, is some guidance for senior leaders on how to invite in challenge. Because, you know, it can be difficult as a senior leader. You know, you do have a certain status and you're in a big meeting, and if someone offers challenge in a way that is an affront to you, that will bring out the antibodies and you might not welcome in the challenge. So I think senior leaders have to get better at inviting in the challenge, and that left-hand side helps them to do that. The right-hand side is for more junior people in how to offer the challenge. And that is things about making sure the challenge is respectful of the senior person's position, but recognizes that the challenge is not about the person, but about the issue that's being challenged. Now, when we developed this, somebody said to me, somebody who actually works in the army, by the way, said to me, isn't that a typically MOD thing, that we have to write down how to do challenge? We should know it instinctively, shouldn't we? Well, I think we have a way to go, because we are a very hierarchical organisation across the services and the Defence Civil Service. And therefore, we need to step back and work out how to invite in challenge and offer it. And I think that guide really helps. In fact, the guide has taken off across government, so it is shared in other government departments as well now, with the MOD branding, which I think is helpful. So the challenge guide is out there. We supported this, by the way, in the Chilcot context with training courses. We do training courses on challenge. We have a network of challenge advocates across defence. We embed it into our organisational procedures increasingly. So you'll find a lot of senior committees now have a so-called challenge board. So the National Security Committee, which is the 4-star committee at official level, beneath ministerial level, has a challenge board. So this is a group of people at sort of OF5 level, generally speaking, who get the same papers as the main committee. But of course, they don't go into the meeting with an agenda, a departmental agenda. They go into the meeting having looked at those papers as objectively as possible. And they send a representative to the main NSCO who reflects the challenge board's views on each agenda item. And apparently it's been revelatory, because you get someone sat at the table who's just coming at it from a very different perspective. So if you're going to be serious about challenge, you have to find those little organisational and institutional tweaks that mean that it kind of gets cemented into the way in which you do business. Otherwise, it's just a thing. Now, why is challenge important? Well, it is about countering that groupthink. And why is countering groupthink important? Well, I think because you're more likely to arrive at good decisions. You're not guaranteed to arrive at good decisions, but you're more likely to arrive at good decisions. And this diagram here comes from the National Health Service. I deal with someone called Dr. Henrietta Hughes, who is the National Guardian for the NHS, which is basically their whistleblowing setup. And I don't know whether you can make sense of this, but what this tells you, I'm going to try and press the right button here. Along the bottom, this is how NHS trusts are ranked. You know, there's a ranking of NHS trusts in terms of how good they are. So outstanding on the left, inadequate on the right. And the interesting thing about this is it directly correlates with the extent to which trusts encourage a culture of speaking out. Speaking up is taken seriously in my organisation. So those trusts which encourage people to recognise their mistakes and talk about them and be open about them so that the organisation learns, they're the outstanding ones. The ones that don't talk about mistakes, don't learn, they're the failing trusts. So there's an extraordinarily clear correlation between organisations that enable that open culture, we call it a just culture, where people talk about the things they've learned, about the mistakes they've made, rather than seeking to cover them up. And related to that, I think that senior leaders of people need to have a willingness to learn. You know, it's about that curious approach, about that inquisitive approach. And this book, Matthew Syers' Black Box Thinking, I put up there, is for me a very powerful discussion about the importance of learning. And so the contrast that he draws in the opening chapters is between the health sector, which, at least in the past, struggled to learn from its mistakes because of cultural issues that were built into the hierarchies and organisation of health services, not just in the UK, and the civil aviation sector, where through a difficult learning process, going back to the 1970s, they introduced new protocols into the way in which they manage the flight deck on civil aviation aircraft, with the net result that globally very, very few people die in civil aviation every year, in contrast to health sectors where the numbers are sadly rather higher. And I think we as an organisation need to reflect as we lead our people on the extent to which we're in the civil aviation box or the health sector box. As I say, the National Guardian's work in the health sector seems to me a quantum leap forward in terms of how they're tackling these issues. We need to ask ourselves in defence where we sit on that spectrum. But as leaders, we need constantly to have that willingness to learn. We do, as leaders, have experience and expertise, and out of that a point of view. But I think we need to constantly be open to learning and possibly, at some point, abandon everything we've learned in the past as wrong and no longer appropriate and no longer adaptive enough for that new perspective. But is leading people enough? It's possible to lead people well, and you can think of people who lead people well, but actually they don't necessarily get the right organisational outcomes. So I don't think it is enough. You have to be able to combine leadership of both issues and people. And that leads me to ask, how do you measure leadership success? Because we don't often come up with a metric. Now, I guess in the military sphere, in many ways, at least in the past, it was very easy to define military success. You win a battle or you lose a battle. In the wider sphere, it's very difficult to measure success. So another title might be The Good Leader, What's the Metric? How do you work out whether you're a good leader or not? How are you measuring this? And I've come up with my own metric, and you may or may not agree with it. We'll find out. My own metric is, it's not an immediate one, because it's what will people say about you in 5 years' time as a leader? Now, as a leader, you can try and imagine what people will be saying about you in 5 years' time. So I guess that's where its power comes from. And they might be saying, who? They might have forgotten you as a leader, in which case you weren't much of a leader. So that's the extreme end of the spectrum. They might be saying, well, they occupied a leadership position, but they weren't really a leader. They were just following a career. They might say that. They might say, well, they weren't very nice, and they weren't particularly effective either. That, I guess, is a real low point on the leadership spectrum. Or they might say they weren't very nice, but at least they were effective. And we all know people like that who aren't very good at leading people, but actually things get done. Or you might have a metric of someone who is a very good leadership person, but not effective. And that's not a happy situation either. There's a sweet spot, isn't there? And that's someone who's both good at leading the issues and at leading people. And how do you condense that sweet spot into a thing? What's the thing that metric becomes? Well, for me, and I increasingly talk about this in my presentations, that thing is reputation. What is your reputation as a leader? That self-awareness, standing outside yourself, trying to understand what your reputation is, trying to understand it from all sorts of sources, whether that's 360, other feedback, simple informal feedback, just trying to understand how you come across to people. That reputation thing, for me, is a fundamental metric of your success or otherwise as a leader. And it's not something that has a number attached to it. It is a bit of a blob. It's a bit vague. But reputation, I think, is all important. And I think leaders need to think much more about what kind of reputation they are going to be carrying into the future, what people will be saying about them in the future, because that's a really good metric in the here and now of how effective they're being as a leader. So we've been through quite a few contending theories of leadership and different titles that we might have had for this talk. From the start point, identifying the need for leadership change, a perfectly fine title, but raised a lot of questions in my own mind about the actual question being asked about leadership. The possibility that there is a bit of a myth of leadership out there, and we need to kind of dismiss some of the fog of that and get hard-nosed about understanding what leadership actually is and what effective leadership actually is. The different models of leadership that we have thrown at us, the Henry V, the Henry Fonda, the JFK, where on the spectrum of different models of leadership do we each individually sit? The leadership through change thing, whether change is a good word, or whether we need to think about adaptation, which leads to that finessing of that concept of leadership being about leading and forcing adaptation in big organizations. Leading people, which for me is totally fundamental. If you can't lead people, you can't lead issues. And then how do you measure all that? How do you measure the successful leader? And so I've come up with a final title. It's not very catchy, I'm afraid, but this is, I guess, what I've been talking about. The modern leader is someone who ensures adaptation. They lead through their people, but all the time they're conscious of their reputation. And that's where I'd like to finish. Thank you.